Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of RPG Radio. My name is Winback, and on today's episode of Armored Core 6, I've got a rather large and chunky build for you with some cheesy chain weapons that should ultimately make playing this game a lot easier, even though there's a lot less mobility. How? You ask, is that possible? Well, we've got a very, very thick health pool, and things are a lot simpler when you don't have to dodge and you can just eat some big ol' hits. Now let's talk about a couple things off the bat real quick here. I'm going to address the elephant in the room apart from the big chunky armored core that we're working with, and that is the chain gun. The chain gun it's cheesy. I'm not gonna lie to you. It didn't feel great using this gun because this build ended up relying on it for some of the bigger boss battles, and that felt bad. It's not to say that it's a bad weapon, it's actually very good in most circumstances, and I think it's that versatility that makes it so popular. That said, I still don't love using it, but at least thematically it works incredibly well. It is a really, really fun to look at weapon, so it goes along with everything else. To counterbalance just how good the chain gun is, we're going to be using the double trouble, which is the chainsaw. And if you have never played with the double trouble before, I have got so many good things to tell you about it, but none of them are about how easy it is to use. So hopefully that'll earn me some cool points at the end of all things instead of just crutch points. But before we go off on the tangent on the weapons for this build, let's talk about the body pieces, because these all work in conjunction very well together, and the Tian King, which is the headpiece, is one of those things required to really set the build off. The reason I'm saying that is because this build has a very precarious weight requirement, and using different heads is something that can push the build over or under what you're looking for. So the Tian King is very, very good for that, even though it doesn't have the greatest scan distance or the greatest stats, period. It does come along with some of its own anti-explosive defense, which is pretty nice. And with the patch that came out recently, a lot of the heads got buffed in their attitude stability, which is your stagger bar. So even though this is pre-patch video, it's still pretty good. I would just consider it overall a decent head, and it thematically or visually works incredibly well with this build. Just like that saw to the face of the headhunter, the headbringer. The edgelord himself, Iguazu, just goes down without even being able to heal, and it is so fantastic. If you're paying attention, you will notice that you can charge up the chainsaw while you are firing the chain gun, and these two weapons work so well together for that reason. That being said, that's more for the later part of the video, but we're starting off this basically test run for the AC with one of the earlier missions that's got you up against two ACs at once for the Rubicon Liberation Front. Once you're on New Game Plus, you get this option. You get the RLF is going to say, hey, in the middle of the mission, will you kill these two guys? We'll pay you a whole bunch more money, and obviously it's money. I'm going after it. If you kill Iguazu first, this mission is infinitely easier because Volta is using the same principles that we're using in our big boy build, in that he's got a very large health bar and it is incredibly hard to one-shot him even with the right weapons. So, because the tanky guy can buy so much more time for the small guy to come in and be a pest, it is really, really important that you take out Headbringer and Iguazu early on. But that's my mission detour for this video, at least for the first mission anyway. Let's look at some more pieces. And no, I'm not talking about all the burning AC tank bits that are laying all over the ground now after meeting that chainsaw. The core for this build is going to be the main dish. This is Cinder Carla's core, actually. This is a heavy core, and just like that, it sports some really strong AP, coming in just under the Qiankang core. It even has slightly more generator output adjustments, which is good because you want to have as much energy as possible, which we'll talk about once we get to the generator for this build. But needless to say, having a big bar for a big boy is going to be a big, beautiful time. This is ultimately a heavy core though, and because of that, it's got a big weight limit with a big health bar, and that is going to make things a little bit more difficult when it comes to the balancing act of keeping all of the weapons and the parts together to make an AC that can move around and deal damage while taking as much damage as possible. You might be surprised to know that building a heavy AC and keeping it mobile isn't as easy as you might expect. The next part on our list is a great example of why it is amazing that this game does not incorporate aerodynamics into its builds and its physics. The Tianlao are the biggest, and that means heaviest arms in the entire category, but on top of that, they boast the highest AP of any of the arms as well, and they had better given the size of those shoulder pads. It looks like we're just straight out of a Blizzard game at this point. Apart from that, the Tianlao do have pretty average, I'd say, melee specialization and firearm specialization, so you're not going to get any huge damage boosts like you would with the Basho for melee weapons, but they're not doing the worst in the world either. That being said, you can't ever go bad with average because it's literally just the middle. And if I can sacrifice some middle tier stats for the best AP in the game on these arms, I think I'm okay with doing that. They do take up a very big chunk of our weight though, so remember that when you're playing this build on your own, if you want to switch out the arms for some lighter arms, you can definitely get more payload with your weapons for that trade-off. But if we're going to be playing a big heavy build, you better believe that we have to have some big heavy legs to hold all of this stuff up. The reason that we're not using tank legs or quadruped legs is because they ultimately don't really fit in with how I wanted this AC to look. So instead, we're going with the VE42A, designed by Arquebus, and these are the heftiest legs in the bin for bipedal movements. These guys actually have the highest AP yet again, and they have a pretty considerable amount of weight limit to them. So everything that you see right now on this AC is pretty hefty with the exception of our split missile launcher, and that is because I wanted to have the bipedal walking juggernaut feel, even though this AC does literally zero walking with these legs. Iguazu almost eating his entire health bar again, barely missing it, getting away with about 2% of his health bar, and you know what, good for him. Taking the full chainsaw is not an easy thing to do. These legs are ultimately going to give you the highest load limit of any of the bipedal or two-legged options because they are the biggest. That being said, if you want to switch over to something like a quadruped or a tank, you can get a higher load limit and you can use bigger weapons with those legs, but you do sacrifice the ease of movement, I think. And maybe ease is the wrong word to use, but there's just something about bipedal legs that are simple, straightforward, easy to understand, and they're not going to go drifting you off into corners or floating you at the wrong time if you're not used to quadrupedal or tank legs. Some of those things can be a little bit confusing if you're starting your own new build, or if you just want to play something mindless. That's really what this build was about. I want to make a quadruped and a tank build, but I do want to make them a little bit more unique than I'm used to seeing, so they're kind of on the back burner for the moment. That being said, again, the bipedal heavy legs are a fantastic option for being this classical style AC straight out of Armored Core 3, and I'm a sucker for nostalgia. So here we have it, the Gatling gun, the Huben, which should be everyone's response when Spider-Man tells you that someone's been shot. If you've never seen it before, which, let's be honest, there is no way you haven't seen this gun in an Armored Core 6 video before, the Gatling gun really does make the game much, much simpler. That is twice as true when you add another Gatling gun to your other hand. If you want to play a big tanky boy and you want to run around with 2 chain guns, that's totally possible, and you can absolutely shred a lot of enemies in the game with relative ease. The reason that the chain gun is so good is because the amount of ammo that it comes with, as well as the way that it reloads, gives you an opportunity to basically only fire when you want to and never have to worry about reloading it. If you use 2 of them, you're going to double the damage output and the impact value, which are both very low, to compensate for just how many attacks this gun will spit out in the span of time that it takes others to shoot. So, where your standard rifle will be shooting 1 bullet per second, the Gatling gun is going to be shooting 20. The reason that the damage and the impact on this gun is so low is because of that attack speed, because we can get so many bullets out on a target before there's any real reason to stop shooting. When you do have to stop shooting on this gun, it is because you have held the trigger down for too long and the weapon has overheated. The overheat does have a pretty considerable cooldown time, so if you're like me and you just like to rip it until the game ends, then you might have to work around a little bit of a cooldown on. But if you decide that you can stick it out and not just hold the button down until eternity, then you should be okay. The cooldown on this bad boy is pretty significant, but if you're going to be a Gatling gun player and it's going to work in that range, it's probably good to learn to turn it off. And I mentioned it earlier in the video, but the chain gun and the chain saw actually work really well together, because the double trouble, which is the double chainsaw, can actually be revved up while you are preparing to throw it. The caveat to that is that your Gatling gun will continue to fire while it is charging up. So while you're getting that bad boy ready for the killing blow, your Gatling gun can still be racking up stagger damage on those more pesky, bigger health bar, bigger stagger bar enemies. Just like the Enforcer, whose door we are about to kick in and have something of a time with.
Intruder detected in closed sector. Defense program phase 3.0. Switching to termination mode. Terminating target.
Now this boss honestly gave me a lot of trouble the first time around, so I figured it would be a good enough excuse to run it through with what is a pretty simple build and see if it could stand up. I was not disappointed, if we're being completely honest. This is one of the cooler bosses in the game, and even though it can be really frustrating in certain circumstances, I think it was a pretty good test of this build, how things stack up, and you have a big throw at something that is usually an unstoppable force. This does, however, lead me back to the double trouble chainsaw and one of the very, very important aspects of this fight. Unfortunately, even with the chainsaw completely revved up, this boss will actually fall out for some reason. When you hit the first swing, it's back up unless you are directly in front of the face and you can fall on the chainsaw. I'm not sure if it's a bug, I'm not sure if it's a good never attack this boss back with the chainsaw, but mostly, I'd say about 50% of chainsaw swings in this fight hit and the stagger on the boss lasts long enough to make that hit connect and ruin the health bar. But that being said, the double trouble is not at all a disappointment when it comes to this build, and it always feels good when you connect that full rev into the face of any enemy at all. The dash that you'll get along with that weapon is also fantastic because you can get some movement in chasing down enemies who are just outside of that reach of a normal melee weapon. That is to say, a booster with a normal dash range. I can't remember what the stat is called here, but which dash. And the enforcer goes down with just a hail of gunfire, because why not? If you caught the electric discharge build last week, you'll be familiar with this. This is the earshot, the grenade cannon we got equipped to our back, and this is ultimately a safety pick for me. It's not the Songbirds, so it doesn't feel ultimate cheese factor, even though they got nerfed with the most recent patch, which is nice to hear. But the earshot has a big wind-up, along with some very damage, and I don't think I can sing the praises of this thing enough. It's cool looking, it feels good to use, and it just isn't the Songbirds, so I don't feel like cheating out anymore. We've made it to the last test of the build though in this video, and there is a reason specifically that I chose Aerie to do this. The reason being, this is one of the probably most difficult bosses in the entire game, and if this build can sustain this fight without driving me absolutely insane, it is going to work in any situation that I want to use it for. That being said, Aerie is just unbelievably obnoxious at times, and you do have to go into this fight knowing at least a couple of ways to deal with the things that she does. Namely, this build works very well against her melee weapons, her swords. When she goes in for the melee attack, it is very easy to dodge through and to the left of her to avoid the melee entirely, get behind her, and start dealing damage with your Gatling gun again. Unfortunately, this build does not have enough time to land a full chainsaw, and it barely has enough time to hit her with the earshot when you punish those melee swings, but as it stands, you can dodge them. It is easy enough. Even with the big, hefty weight of this build, you don't die instantaneously to lots of cheesy melee hits. Dodging her ranged abilities is much more problematic because there are very, very many more of them, but that's the price you pay when you play such a big boy, and you can eat a decent number of them. You're seeing one of the first attempts that I tried against this boss with this build, and I will not lie to you, it did take me quite a few to get through to her. I cannot forget, however, to mention the split missile launcher. This is the dual split missile launcher, actually, and these are the unsung hero of this fight specifically. Before I came into this, I could not find a decent weapon to actually hit Aerie in terms of missiles, because a lot of them were either too heavy or they weren't working the way that I wanted them to. But with the split missile launcher, I've had a lot of really inconsistent experience prior to this point, but with this build and with this fight specifically, it went so much better than I ever could have expected. Previously, I was trying to use a whole bunch of different weapons in this back left slot, and that ranges from the Javelin Beta missile launcher to the Javelin Alpha, which is a grenade launcher that goes in your hand. So there was some weapon swapping, and it just really didn't feel good. Swapping to a grenade launcher leaves this big open window of time in which you're not doing anything, and Aerie's stagger bar is steadily dropping down, and by steadily I mean rapidly dropping down. So she doesn't stay staggered for a whole lot of time, and you don't really get to use those windows of swap well enough, at least not in this boss fight. So I needed missiles, and I needed them to be light, and I needed them to be consistent, and that was everything. Boxes checked for the split missile launcher, except for the consistency part. So, true to form with Armored Core 6, I tried something new, and I was actually rewarded with a very, very good outcome. The split missile launcher, the dual split missile launcher specifically, did plenty of work in this fight. It chased Aerie down, it got a lot of her dodges out of the way early on, and when they did connect, they're doing a pretty considerable amount of stagger because there are a good chunk of them. The missile launcher, like I said earlier, is the unsung hero of this build, and specifically against Aerie, I was absolutely blown away with how much I was getting out of these tiny little missiles. But we can't just talk about the fun things in this build all day long. If a build is going to have heroes, it's also going to have the people who hold the heroes up. Your workhorses, your civilians, your guys who handle the supply lines, your Rabute Killimans. The FCS, the boosters, and the generator, all three things required to make this build work at maximum efficiency in a number of different ways. The Flugel boosters are a very strong compromise between melee attack thrust, quick boost thrust, and quick boost cooldown time, up with the G2P05 FCS, which is boasting some incredibly good medium range targeting with average close range targeting and pretty bad long range. This build isn't going very far, so having high medium is good for tracking quick targets. And then we'll wrap it all up in a big pretty bow with the Santai generator, the actually perfect generator for any heavy bipedal AC. This generator actually boasts a capacity higher than the Coral generators, which is pretty interesting because those guys are built to have huge capacity and huge reload of that capacity in order to make those Coral weapons work the best that they can. That being said, you want to have the biggest capacity that you can get when it comes to these builds, because you do have to do a fair amount of quick boosting and you do need a lot of energy to get these big boys off the ground when it comes to vertical dodging. Heavy bipedal ACs are easy to handle, but they do come with a couple caveats when it comes to building them to make sure that you can get the most mobility out. If I didn't drive home that weight part of this build enough in the early parts of this video, the Santai is going to be one of the heaviest generators in the list, so remember that when you are trying to do this build on your own or make something similar in the vein of a big heavy juggernaut AC. The Santai is gross in what it can do in your energy output, but it is also gross what it can do in holding you down because the weight is absolutely ridiculous. That being said, we are in space, so I feel like it should be a little bit less difficult to boost here, but you know what? I made that comment earlier about aerodynamics and how I would never survive in a wind tunnel, so I'll take the gravity in the Aerie fight as penance. And that is it for all the pieces and parts required to play this Juggernaut Chain Gun Chainsaw Split Missile Earshot build. This is going to be a fantastic time for you, I promise. If you're going through New Game Plus, playing a Juggernaut is one of the most rewarding ways to play because it never, ever gets old shrugging off damage from all sorts of enemies and opening them up with a fully revved up Double Trouble. It really just came all together for me. The fantasy, the silhouette, the visuals, everything about this build took me all the way back to that opening cinematic in Armored Core 3 and just playing that game for hours and hours and hours on end. But as Aerie breathes her last with an earshot to the face and a chainsaw to the back, that is it for this video, everyone. I will see you all next week with another fun Armored Core 6 build, and we'll see just how much fun we can have on the new patch with some new exciting builds. Peace out, everybody.